Okay, so today's class, I don't remember exactly, but I think it's called The Secret Life of Esther. Um, Something like The Secret Life of Esther and what we learn about Emunah, something like that. Hopefully, that's what we're going to try to understand. A little bit more of what Esther was really going through, who she really was, and what her story can help us as Jewish women living through today's times can really take from her incredible lessons. And of course, just like everything that we all know when we read through Jewish texts, things are not really just as they appear on the surface. So we have to look a little bit deep and try to think about this in the way that it was actually really happening. Okay, so first of all, I think one of the things that sometimes surprises all of us to know is that this story was not like a few days long, right? Like we get into the Purim vibe and we start with, let's say, Parsha Zachor, and then we have Taanis Esther, and then we have Purim, and we sort of experience the whole story over the course of a few days and almost feels like that's how it happened. But it really didn't happen that way. This was something that the Jewish nation was living with for about 9 years. And the very sort of climactic part of it, like the very intense part of the story, was really going over the course of about a year. So in a way, I think some of us now can start to relate to that, right? Like if we're putting this in our own context, we have certainly been living since October 7th. Now we're already almost up to, well, at least 2.5 years, going on 3 years of this very long narrative and knowing that what's happening today, like literally in the moments that we're living through, the fact that we're meeting today on Zoom is a culmination of what began on October 7th, but everybody knows really started to be a thing even before that. Certainly for those of us that were not living in Israel pre-October 7th, myself included, we're starting to feel the what's the word? Like we were starting to smell the fumes of anti-Semitism rising, right? As we were, many of you probably were in college and high school, we're starting to experience what a world where anti-Semitism exists actually looks like, which is not really the same world that I was growing up in, right? And then, of course, we find ourselves pre-October 7th, October 7th, and then the reality of October 8th, which I don't have to tell anybody what that looks like because we've all been living through it since then and are still today. And here we are, really in historic times, literally reliving the Purim story um, in a way that it's just almost overwhelming to actually think about that what's happening in these moments as we're here together and going through it. So let's try to get some perspective. Okay, so who was Esther? Who was Esther? She was a nice Jewish girl, really. She had a hard family situation. She objectively did. I think that being said, people were kind of used to having hard family situations in those days. I mean, life expectancy wasn't as long, and people ended up often in, I don't know, alternative family situations, just like she did. She happened to find herself in the home of really the gadol hador of that generation, right? Like that was Mordechai. Mordechai was the spiritual leader of the people. And yes, they were in exile, but they were very much, they were very close to having been living in Eretz Yisrael in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, Mordechai actually was zocha to have been here in Israel, to have seen the Beis Hamikdash. Like he knew what it was all about. He knew Jewish spirituality, and he was really leading and guiding from a spiritual perspective the Jewish nation in Galut at that time. And this was the home that Esther was growing up in. Very important to have that context. She wasn't someone who was assimilated. She wasn't somebody who would, easily and willingly just take the opportunity to go and live in the king's palace. This was not like simple stuff for her. Okay. Now, of course, when we're all little girls and we want to dress up as Queen Esther and we put on our queen's the tiaras and the beautiful dresses and everything, we think it's like really wonderful and fun to be the queen. But do you think that was the experience that she was having? Probably not. Let's reframe, okay? Let's even take from our own perspective in life now and everything that we know about our values and what we believe in, and imagine being uprooted from that and having to go live with this tyrant of a king and to be his wife, and also assuming that there's never going to be an end to it, right? It wasn't a temporary little stint in the palace. This was Esther's whole life. So, from the beginning, we have to understand that her experience in the palace was a life of total self-sacrifice. And what happens when you know there's self-sacrifice for a purpose? You're sacrificing yourself, but you know there's a purpose to it, right? Does that make it a little bit easier to have that feeling of sacrifice? Good. Did Esther have any idea at the beginning of this story that her life was going to have purpose in the palace? Good. Everyone's shaking their head. No way. She just thought that she, against her will, had been chosen to be this object of the king's fancy in the palace. She had no idea how things were actually going to turn out. And in fact, she wasn't even seeing that. She wasn't like, oh, maybe I'll have an opportunity to make a difference when she first went into this new role of hers. Nevertheless, we do know that um, she managed to really live a life of a very strong dual identity. And actually, her name, Esther, of course, we all know, means hiddenness, right? Esther shares the root with nistar, which means hidden, lehastir, to hide. She was Esther, she was hidden. And I don't think that that means, of course, that she in reality or her essence was hidden, but I think that it has something to do, besides the other themes of hiddenness in the Megillah, which we are going to get to later on, just in terms of describing her very essence. Esther was a master at hiding what needed to be hidden, right? And then, of course, we find out later revealing what also needed to be revealed. Now, how do we see that? And what are the like beautiful traits that we see in her character, even before she is called upon to become Queen Esther in the way that we know her? So, first of all, actually, it's interesting because in our moments of inspiration, as we've been going through the qualities that Pirkei Avos exhorts us to master in order to acquire Torah, we see some examples of that in Esther already. So from the very beginning, we learn about Esther that she's a master of this quality that we call shtika. What does shtika mean? Okay, I know you're not going to unmute every time I ask a little question, but I do want you to think about it when I'm asking the questions, right? So shtika means to be quiet, right? It means lehashtik is to be actually to become to be silent. So Esther is silent when she needs to be silent. And this Mordecai tells her from the very beginning. Don't tell anybody who you are. Don't tell them where you come from, where you came from. It comes from a very important place, actually, that we learn through the Mefarshim she gets from her lineage, from her legacy, right? Esther comes from the tribe of Binyamin. She is really a descendant of Shaul, of Binyamin, of Rachel, all people whose stories in the Torah give us this quality of being silent in the face of the need for silence. Okay, we could just speak about Rachel for a moment. Rachel, of course, we know that one of the greatest things that she did was to keep quiet when her her sister was put under the chuppah with the one that she wanted to marry. And instead of worrying about herself and her own needs, she made the choice to allow this to happen for her sister. Okay. let's just take a moment to think about that in our own lives for a minute, where this quality of shtika actually comes in and becomes very, very important. I just will say it in particular because it's not really a virtuous quality in our generation. Do you know what I mean? Like keeping quiet is not something that we appreciate being told to do. We like to make our voices heard. We like to speak our opinions. We like to make sure that we speak out about the things that we care about and that are important to us. So to be told that shtika is actually a virtuous quality or a value actually doesn't really stem with society today, right? Like everything is about pride. Okay, I don't just mean that kind of pride, but I mean like pride. Let's be proud and be proud of who we are and put it out there and let it all out. And we certainly have many places to use that voice, not just amongst our small friend groups or amongst our family, right? And very often we don't actually employ this midah of shtika. We sort of see it as a value not to do that. But in truth, knowing when to use your voice and when not to use your voice is a an incredibly important character quality. I think we spoke about this a little bit last week in class. We talked about the idea of knowing of knowing when to speak and when not to speak, right? When to hold back and when to use our voices. Esther was quite the master of this, and we learn it from her. And perhaps this comes from another quality that she displays, and of course, another quality that we've talked about quite at length, and that is the quality of humility. Now, if you remember, humility, being a humble person, we have defined very differently than perhaps what would normally come to mind. Because sometimes when we talk about humility, we think about negating our sense of self, right? We talk about minimizing ourselves. And really, I don't think that's how the Torah describes humility. And if we think about it and we look at the quality of humility on a spectrum, right? What is at the other end of being a humble person? What's the opposite of humility? And this I will ask you to unmute.
Ego.
Good. Excellent. Very excellent. And what's a negative form of ego?
Insecurity.
Well, it may come from insecurity, but how does it appear?
Like arrogance.
Yeah, good. Okay, so on the one hand, we have uh ego, which often you're right, does come from a strong sense of insecurity. On the other end, we have what's the opposite of arrogance? It's not humility. What comes on the opposite side? If you go all the way to if you're looking at a spectrum of this quality, you have arrogance on this side, and you have all the way on the other end.
Like self-neglectment.
Good, excellent. So self-negation, right? Putting yourself down. Is that humility? Does humility equal putting yourself down? No, it doesn't.
No.
Elizabeth, explain, because you seem to be sure about that.
Because humility, you know where you stand. You don't need to
Exactly.
go out there and do something. But self-neglect, on the other hand, is like you don't know, like you think lower of yourself.
Exactly. So when you are in that proper place with your midah of humility, of anava, we call it in Hebrew, right? It's not necessarily that you're on one end of that spectrum, but you've found the proper place in the spectrum between thinking too highly of yourself and not thinking enough of yourself, right? Humility actually means that you know who you are, and therefore you have the confidence to be who you are in the right way at the right time. And the way we've defined this in class before is um, as follows, that humility really equals occupying the right amount of space for the situation that you're in. So let me give you an example that to me works very well. Today I'm teaching, right? So I'm in class with all of you, and if I didn't occupy the right amount of space, it would be a pretty awful class, right? Meaning like if I wasn't like the one doing the talking and the one sort of guiding the class in the direction that I want it to go and getting your involvement and so forth, all the things that go into teaching, right? If I wasn't occupying that space in this virtual room, then things wouldn't be going very well. So that's what's called on me at this moment. Now, if somebody else was teaching this class and I was here in the Zoom room with all of you and I was doing all the talking, I would not be occupying the proper amount of space. I would be taking up too much space. You've all been in that situation? Yeah. So everybody just take a moment and let's not think about others because who cares what, everybody has their own work and growth to do. But let's think about ourselves for a minute and think about situations that we're in and asking ourselves, are we taking up the right amount of space? So sometimes it's in the dorms, right, with our friends. Sometimes it's in class. Now, these are all examples for all of you as your students. And sometimes it's in the workplace. If you're in the workplace and you're not occupying the right amount of space, maybe you're not doing your job very well, right? But if you're occupying too much space, meaning you're telling the boss what to do, maybe you're also not occupying the right amount of space. So this is a very, very important quality in our own personal development of character. And Esther herself actually seemed to be quite a master of this. We see it in her, right? We see that when she went into the palace, she was doing exactly what was expected of her. She followed what Mordecai asked her to do. She didn't reveal who she was. She didn't go in there kicking and screaming and fighting, but she also didn't sort of, she had to do what she had to do. But amazingly, this life that she was taken into, she really could have started to have very high expectations for what it meant to be the queen in the palace. She could have said, well, maybe this is what God wants for me. This is where he put me. So I'm going to get into the luxury and I'm going to get into the clothes and I'm going to get into my role and start ordering people around and all of that. But what do we know about her? That she really held on to her values. In fact, there's a whole medrash, and we don't have time to go into it now, about how she got the ability to keep Shabbos while she was going through this process of preparing for the beauty pageant where she was ultimately selected, right? So she figured out how to keep Shabbos in the palace. She figured out how to hold on to her values. And yes, there were things that she had to do that I'm sure were torture for her. And we have to remember that. It was a life of self-sacrifice, but she maintained this incredible ability to be who she was and at the same time to know her role, to occupy the proper amount of space. Now, things start to change, right? Because up until this point, we've talked about humility and we've talked about keeping quiet, which are virtuous qualities, even though they might rub us the wrong way to think about them as being virtuous. But this actually all does start to change because the next thing that we learn from Esther's story, from the Megillah, is that when she needed to take personal responsibility, she was right there to do it. Okay. So how does this unfold? Okay. We spoke already about Esther growing up in the house of Mordecai and really knowing. She had chinuch, no Beis Yaakov, but she got it all from the home. She knew what it meant to be a Jewish woman. And Mordecai raised her with love. We see that with tenderness. And so what happens, okay, in the story at this very pivotal moment. And maybe I'll share the screen actually, and we can just take a look at it together. So the time comes when there's this very terrible edict that is sent out regarding the Jews coming from Haman based on his absolute inability to get past Mordecai's adherence to his values, right? What drives Haman the most crazy is Mordecai being who he is. Mordecai being a proud Jew that won't acquiesce to Haman's command to bow to him. By the way, guys, hear this and take it with you deeply, right? This is how we are the most successful is when we don't acquiesce, when we do hold strong to our values, and when we're, oh, I'm starting to hear rumbles, which is usually the, do you guys hear that? You're hearing them too. Okay, so we're going to keep going, but we may need to take a break. Okay. I haven't gotten any alarm or anything, but I hear it outside. So anyway, okay, personal responsibility, being strong. Right. That's what drove Haman the most crazy is when Mordecai was a proud, strong Jew. And I'm not saying we're out in the world to drive people crazy. That's certainly not our role, but being proud, strong Jews is the way um, to to really be who we are, right? And to make sure that in the long part of the story, which is really what this is all about, we've held true to ourselves and our values. That's what we learned from Mordecai, and that's what we learned from Esther. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. Okay, my son just said that everywhere around us is there are sirens. So we may have to pause. Um, and I don't actually have permission to share the screen. So
Wait, I'm gonna give you permission.
okay, thanks.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Okay. Let me just find where my Safari is. I mean, Safaria I have open. Should be here. Yeah, here. Okay, so let's just read through these psukim. Okay, what we've said now, where we are in the Megillah is that I have to just move you guys to the top of my screen. There we go. Okay, so so we have now this text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for the destruction of the Jewish people, and Mordecai sends a messenger, Hasach, to go and inform Esther of what is going on. Now, at first, what does Esther say back to Mordecai? Somebody tell me. Anyone know? Belle, go for it.
Tova
No,
knows.
I don't want
Oh,
to tell.
Tova knows. What's her first initial response?
She's like, what are you doing?
Say more.
Um, I don't know. That's what she said. She was like, why are you like, get dressed, wear clothes.
Well, yes, that is true, actually. She does not like that Mordecai is wearing sackcloth. And the first thing that she does is she sends out clothes for him in order to put on regular clothes. But I think that was more because he really wasn't able to come into the palace with the sackcloth on. It is kind of a funny interaction. I have to admit that I understand it very much. In fact, my mother-in-law literally every day screaming at my father-in-law about what he's wearing. And I just started laughing because this is what this exchange sounds like. She's like, take off that sackcloth and put on something and look presentable, which is what my mother-in-law says to my father-in-law. And now I find myself saying to my husband, it is not one of the things that I feel good about. But anyway, I identified very much with this part of the story. But the next thing that happens, right, is that Mordecai gives this message to Esther and tells her really that she has the opportunity to do something about it, right? He says, Right. He gave Hasach, this is the messenger, the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for their destruction. And he bade him to show it to Esther and inform her and charge her to go to the king to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. Now, keep in mind, this is coming through a messenger, right? And the messenger goes and gives Esther the message, and her response was not in that moment, yes, I will go. Okay. Now, this fits with what everything else that we have just said. Actually, what she says back to the messenger, she says to him, everybody knows that if anyone goes to the king in his inner court without being summoned, there is but one law for him. He will be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter to him may he live. Now, I have not been summoned by the king in 30 days. So she knows her place. This is what we've just said about her. This is what we've just said is one of her best qualities. She actually knows what is appropriate and isn't appropriate. And we see it here. She's saying, I cannot go to the king. He hasn't called for me. In fact, he hasn't called for me in 30 days. And if I go there, it's going to be my demise. Okay. So Mordecai is told what Esther said back to Hasach, and then he delivers the famous message to Esther. What does he say? Don't imagine that you, of all Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. Okay, that's kind of like scary. But then he says, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. So let's paraphrase. You won't be saved necessarily just because you're in the king's palace. If this is a decree against all the Jewish people, you are going to suffer the same fate, right? And he says to her, and by the way, who knows, maybe it's because of this that you have attained this royal position, right? Just to be in the right place in time for this kind of a crisis. Who knows, he says. He's not sure. It's possible, but he's not sure. So what does Esther say back to Mordecai? Okay. I actually want to just go back. If you keep silent in this crisis, let's read what that says in Hebrew. Ki im hecharesh tacha. Sorry, that was a lawnmower outside. Im hecharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. He doesn't say if you keep silent. Really, a cheresh in Hebrew is a deaf person, somebody who can't hear. What he's saying to her is if you choose not to hear what is happening, if you choose not to hear what you are being called to do in this moment, you're going to miss the opportunity that perhaps you were put here in this position to hear. Okay? It's not just about keeping quiet. It's if you make this choice to be deaf to what's happening around you. Now, girls, let's be honest. How often do we do this? How often is there a call for a need that maybe we can fulfill and we just want to pretend that we didn't hear it, or we didn't want to see that text on a group chat asking for help, or we get a call from a friend, or we know that there's a friend in need, right? We know it because we've heard it from other people or because we've seen it ourselves, but we choose to stay deaf. We choose to ignore the need. How many times do we do that? I'm speaking to myself as much as I'm speaking to everyone else. And that's what Mordecai, in his time and in his situation, is telling Esther. These don't have to be life-changing things. Sometimes it's the small things. Are you choosing not to hear what you are being called to do? And how does Esther reply? Vatomer Esther lehashiv el Mordechai. And Esther said in response to Mordecai, Okay? Lech, knossos Yehudim. Go, assemble the Jews who live in Shushan and fast in my behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will do the same. Then I shall go to the king, though it contrary to the law, and if I am to perish, I will perish. V'ka'asher avadati avadati. Now, guys, I know I probably sounded funny when I was reading this, but did I sound different when I was reading these verses than when I read the other verses? I did. Yes, nod, right? I did. Why did I sound different? Because everything about Esther in that moment pivoted, it shifted, it changed. At that moment, she recognized her responsibility, her need to do something different. And she went from being in the place of passivity, in the place of allowing this story to unfold around her without her decisive action, to being empowered to a position of being decisive. And you see that she starts ordering everybody else around. She recognizes in that moment what she is being called to do, and she starts giving the orders. You go assemble the Jews who live in Shushan, fast, don't eat, don't drink, and I will do the same. Okay. And then she says, I will go to the king, and though it's against the law, I'm going to do what I'm being called to do, and it's not up to me. The rest is not up to me. If I perish, I will perish. V'ka'asher avadati avadati. This is in one little pasuk. This is the calling to each and every one of us as we all go through our lives. We are humble. We spend a lot of time listening to what's going on around us, learning, making sure that we're acting in the way that we're acting that is appropriate for the situation that we're in. We keep quiet when we need to keep quiet. We're vocal when we need to be vocal. And then when we are put into a position of needing to take responsibility, we act. And when we act, we get help from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even if we don't know the outcome. Okay. Now, in Esther's case, this was big throughout our lives. This happens in ways that aren't necessarily this big. Maybe one of us will have the opportunity to make a huge difference, right? So we don't need to be thinking just on the big scale, on the large scale. We need to be thinking about the opportunities that HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts in our path to stand up, to take responsibility, to pivot, and to start being the active character in our own story. Okay. Whew. It's super intense. Now, just give me a second here to readjust. Okay, where did you guys go? Okay, 1 second. So, the last thing I just want to say about Esther's story in particular is that there is something else that is so incredible that we learn from Esther about this big thing that she's about to do. And that is that she recognizes from the very beginning that she can't do it alone. Because what do we see? In the moment that she shifts in her head, the moment that she goes from being hidden, passive Esther and becomes this change maker and starts giving the orders and being the active character in her story, the first thing that she does is to reach out to the community for help. She knows that she can't do it alone. And that's why she tells the people to gather and to fast and to pray on her behalf, because she needs them. And guys, this is another like life-changing thing that each one of us can learn from Esther, is that we don't have to go through life alone. And we shouldn't go through life alone. And that when we're going to do big things, when we're going to make big life changes, when we're going to, even small, it doesn't even have to be big, right? We we need the community behind us. Now, the imperative is that we don't just call on the community when we need it, right? The work that we have to do is to ensure that we have that community that is there for us when we need it and when we go through times of challenge and big decisions and big, right? So the work that we put in is to build that sense of community, friends, mentors, teachers, really when you guys go out into the world after you leave MRC to find yourself in a place where you have the ability to have community and to make yourself a contributive part of that community so that when you need it, it's there for you as well. Does that make sense? Okay, let's do a really quick recap. We've learned about Esther, that as the story begins, we learn from her what it means to recognize who she is as a Jewish woman and to recognize her place in the story, to keep quiet when she needs to keep quiet, but nevertheless to continue to be, sorry, there's like construction noises that are very confusing. To continue to be who she is, right? Even in the face of complete adversity, when she didn't know the ending of the story. She didn't know even that she was there for a reason, and she certainly didn't know that she was going to change the destiny of the Jewish people. Nevertheless, she remained strong in her faith and who she was. She was humble and embodied the Midah of Shtika as well. Eventually, as she gets into the point where she needs to do something, she also recognizes that being humble, recognizing her proper place, meant that she had the ability to make big change, and she puts herself there again without knowing the outcome. She doesn't know that things are going to end okay, but she puts herself in that place. By the way, I think it's an important thing also for us to just keep in mind is that even though the Jewish people were saved on account of Esther, it doesn't even mean that on a personal level she has a redemption. You realize that? She ends up being relegated to a life as Achashverosh's queen, meaning she doesn't get her own personal geula despite the fact that she puts herself on the line. It's really, really a hard pill to swallow. But let's not get derailed with that and let's stay focused. So when the opportunity arises for her to pivot and to take this role as the one who is in the unique position to save the Jewish nation, she does it. And she calls on the community for help and support. She doesn't do it alone. Okay, now I want to ask you, we know that she's called Queen Esther and that the theme of the Megillah is hiddenness. Okay, we know there's a lot going on, as we just described, behind the scenes that's making all of this happen. And of course, we today attribute that to God, even though it's not spelled out for us in the Megillah. So I want to ask you, maybe you've thought about it, maybe you've had classes already about it. What was the point? What is the point of God being hidden? Meaning we see it in the Megillah, but really in the Megillah, this is just a template for our whole life. We go through life with our own personal narratives, things unfolding in the way that they fold, and not our personal narratives only, but on a national level. We are living in the midst of the unfolding of a national narrative, and we have no idea how it's going to unfold. And we actually don't even see God in this narrative in a very clear way. Can everyone agree with that? Even though we're all spiritual people and we're spiritually oriented and we're trying to cast a spiritual lens on it and we see miracles, we have seen miracles. If you don't see the miracles in the last few years, wake up because we're seeing them, right? But it's still not God showing himself to us clearly in a revealed way. Guys, why is that? Why is this the way that we're going through life? Now you can unmute. Yeah, Nechama.
So when I when I think about our relationship with God, as being one that is a loving relationship,
I think that um God hides himself from us. Oops. Well,
Okay, let's go. Everyone come back when you're done so we can finish up, okay? Okay, so where were we? We were starting to talk about this concept of hiddenness and actually the question of why, in particular, God is hidden from the Megillah, but not just from the Megillah, like in our own lives. Okay, why is it that we experience our relationship with God today, in today's reality, as something that is hidden and hard sometimes, honestly, to relate to? And I think Sarah Nechama was going to give us some perspective. But you have to unmute, hon.
hi. So, when I contemplate like why God created the mask of nature and hides himself from us, I think that in order for us to have an actually loving relationship with him, um, it has to be consensual. And so we have to have the ability to choose to look away from him. Because if we could see him in full, we would have no choice but to love him because he is like our everything. But he hides himself from us for the purpose of allowing us to continue to choose him. Um, and 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 I think that's very like it's extremely loving of him to give us that option, right? Like it's self-sacrificing of him because he wants our love. It's like his ultimate essence. That's why he created us. But he also recognizes that in order for it to be real love, he has to let us not love him. Which is also why he created idols and why he makes it possible for us to be atheist. And and in a world where everything is good, he's too clear for us to not choose him. So,
Okay,
or
so
where
what?
everything is revealed good.
Good. So you're focusing on this more, not only, but more specifically on the relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch
Oh
Hu, with
no,
God,
our
and
Wi-Fi's really
that
bad.
by hiding himself or constricting himself itself from us, it puts us in a situation where we need to choose the relationship. Because if we could see God clearly, then it would remove that aspect of choice. That's the nature of God, right? That if God were all revealed, it would take away our ability to choose the relationship. Now, it's an excellent jumping off point, and I'm gonna use it. But does anybody else have an idea of why the way that you personally, it doesn't have to be, some academic or religious explanation, but like in your own life, everybody has had to reconcile this. Every time we stand up to say Shemona Esrei and we're talking to a
Sorry guys, can we use someone else's hotspot?
It's
Mine?
not connected anymore.
No.
You could also put mine back on. Hold up.
You guys have to like turn them off and turn them. Like, you guys have to turn them back on.
Yeah. Mine's on.
Did everyone get disconnected or just me? Just me?
Our Wi-Fi is really bad, so we're kind of like in and out.
Okay. Anyway, I actually, the meeting cut off and restarted. Anyway, let's keep going. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu were revealed to us, we would have no ability to choose the relationship with him because it would be obvious and clear to us. Now, that is one excellent point. Does anybody else, what I was starting to say before I got interrupted rudely, is that all of us have had to come to terms with this because otherwise, how do we stand in Shemona Esrei and daven or any of the other tefillot that we say when we don't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly or revealed to us? So anybody else have anything to add? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. Hi. Wait, I'm gonna
Hi.
put on my glasses so I could see y'all. I heard this idea on a podcast that the way that the world is arranged with like the 6,000 year situation, where the first 2,000 years was like Hashem was more clear because that was the area of the written Torah, and how like we had like prophets and we that was saying Hashem's will, and then it was like we were way closer, and then well, that's actually the second 2,000 years. The first 1,000 years was like creation. So now we're in like the last set from the three, and this set is the one of like the oral tradition, where it's like now, we have these rabbis, and now it's like rabbi this says that, or rabbi this says that. And before we didn't really have that, because we were getting information directly from Hashem. So we kind of moved on, and now we're kind of taking the Torah and making it our own. How can we like apply it to our life with like the rabbis and understanding that? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm going to take what you said and I'm going to combine it with what Sarah Nechama said, because both of you are making a very important point. And actually, Elizabeth, we're going to come back to that whole concept when we wrap this all up. So what Elizabeth is saying is that in the original way that the Jewish nation lived, closer to creation, and then of course during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, when there was still nevuah that was present, is we did have a lot more access to the revealed will of God in that time. Okay. And very interesting that the book of Esther actually comes at a time where we are transitioning. We are transitioning to having access to the revealed will of God, to a time which we're actually living in today. You may have vote, girlies. Why don't you remute again? Okay. A time where that period of transition from when we lived with much more of a sense of the revealed will of God through nevuah, through our prophets, to the time that we're living in, which extends until today, where we don't have access to nevuah in the way that we did at that time, and we certainly don't have the revealed presence of God in our lives. That is such an important point to make, because this is what the book of Esther is going to come to teach us, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, what both of you have aptly said, and maybe what other people are thinking, right, is that with the revealed presence of God, in many ways, it removes the aspect of choice from our life, right? So even going back to the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, when nevuah was present, there was less of an aspect of choice, because what God wanted from us was clear. So people were able to do the will of God because they knew it. Today, we don't have that. And as a result, we have to elevate the importance of our own personal responsibility and our partnership with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation, in making the world do what it needs to do, in bringing God into this world. We have a role, because if God were perfectly revealed in the world, he wouldn't need us to bring him into the world. And this, ladies, is the unbelievable challenge and opportunity that we all have. That opportunity to take HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to bring him into the world. That is our role, to be partners. And that is what Esther recognized in that moment. Now, with your permission, I don't think anybody has anywhere to run off to. I'd like to just tell you two very quick, one really good quick story and one other lesson, and we'll wrap it all up. So anybody know the story of Chaim Weitzman and a guy by the name of Eddie Jacobson? Just raise your hand if you've heard this story. Okay, this is crazy because nobody's heard the story, including me. I didn't know the story until very recently. This is a story that changed the nature of the state of Israel, and it changed the nature of the Jewish nation, and nobody really knows the story. So it goes like this. After the tragedy in Europe, not the tragedy, I mean the absolute devastation of Europe, right? So we were working very hard as a people to get a place for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Dr. Chaim Weizmann, he's a famous Jew. His name is on many streets and today in the state of Israel. He was the head of the Zionist Congress at that time. He was fighting for the creation of a state. Now, what did we need more than anything in order to make that happen? We needed the recognition of the United States. We needed that stamp of approval, and we weren't getting it. Why? Because just exactly like today, President Truman was in office and he was getting pushback from within his own government to hold back the validation for the creation of a state of Israel. And he was listening to it. He was more worried about his politics and his ability to retain power. And he wasn't, he was a good Baptist, but I don't think he had any particular reason to be in favor of supporting this downtrodden nation who had just come out of the horrors and the devastation of Europe. It wasn't like he had an intrinsic desire to be helpful. And at the same time, he was getting all this pushback. So Chaim Weizmann finds out about a guy by the name of Eddie Jacobson. Now, Eddie Jacobson was a Jew. And I don't know if he was unaffiliated, but he certainly wasn't a traditional Orthodox Jew in the way that we know it. He was somebody that grew up in Kansas City with President Truman. And I believe that they knew each other through a few different ways. They struck up a friendship when I'm trying to remember who it was. One of them worked in a bank, and the other one was like a young teenager that was coming into the bank. And they made friends, and they used to chat, and they had a nice relationship. And eventually, they ended up going into business together. And eventually, they parted ways. Jacobson continued in the garment business, and Harry Truman went off and got involved in politics, and life went on. Okay, now here Harry Truman is President of the United States with the ability to change the fate and the destiny of the Jewish people, and he doesn't want to do it. There's a guy, old friend of Truman, a Jew by the name of Eddie Jacobson. He's maybe not a simple Jew, but he's certainly not a prominent Jew, okay? He realizes through the encouragement of those that knew about his relationship with Truman, he realizes that he's the one with the destiny moment to make this happen. And he goes to Washington, he goes unannounced and shows up to meet with the president. He goes into the president's office, into Truman's office, and Truman says to him the following: Eddie, I'm happy to see you, my old friend. Okay, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, I'm very happy to see you. Let's talk about anything, but don't talk to me about Israel. I don't want to hear it. And Eddie stands at the entrance to his office, and who knows what he was doing in that moment. I'd like to think he was asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for help in what to say, but I don't know. But he notices a little statue on Truman's desk, and he says to President Truman, "Who is that?" And President Truman says, "Well, it's my hero, Andrew Jackson." Interesting choice of a hero, by the way, but we were not going to go there. So Eddie, Mr. Jacobson, says to the president at that moment, "Harry, your hero is Andrew Jackson. Mine is a man named Chaim Weizmann, and I want you to meet with him." And at that moment, President Truman agrees. He meets with Chaim Weizmann, and of course, the rest is history. The United States ratified the Israeli Declaration of Independence 11 minutes after it was passed here in Israel. Okay, this man, Eddie Jacobson, nobody knows, but it is written about. It's a documented story. He changed the fate of the Jewish nation. Now, it could have come from a different place. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have picked another shaliach, certainly, but he didn't pass up on the opportunity to do the right thing on behalf of the Jewish nation, and he did it. I just want to give you one other quick, very quickly. We've all heard of Viktor Frankl. Yes, everybody's heard of Viktor Frankl. Okay, so Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and there he documents his experiences in Auschwitz and how he was able to get through the horrors of Auschwitz by creating a sense of meaning in his experience. What he basically knew through his own work and through his God granted, I'm sure, Siyata Dishmaya, the ability that he had to understand that is, if he was able to create meaning out of his experience, he would be okay. And he not only kept that for himself and it allowed him to get through the experience of being in Auschwitz, but he taught that to others. And he helped others in the camps to develop a sense of purpose and meaning. And through that, he survived and went on to build a very meaningful life. The reason I bring up this book is not just to tell you about the book, but to tell you that this was the experience also of the hostages in the recent tragedies that they went through. Okay. It was told about Hirsch, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, that he had read the work of Viktor Frankl. He had read Man's Search for Meaning. It was a very important book in his life. And when he was in the tunnels, he held on to the teachings of Viktor Frankl, and he didn't just hold on to them for himself. He taught them to the other hostages, and somehow through the channels of communication, these underground channels of communication, he was able to pass this along. This idea that if people could only develop a sense of meaning and purpose for their existence, for their situation, that they would be okay. And that's why we see that and Hashem made this clear to us when we were able to get access to the video of them lighting Hanukkah candles in captivity, that they lived with this, that they created ways to make meaning. And the last images that we have of this group of hostages is them taking this concept of bringing light into a dark world. Now, I would like to bring this back to each one of us and to say that each one of us has our Esther moments. As I mentioned before, they're not always going to be the ones like Eddie Jacobson had, or hopefully not the ones of Viktor Frankl and Hirsch Goldberg Poland, and not even Esther. But we all have our destiny moments where we realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has concealed himself for the very purpose of making us the partners in bringing him into this world. I'm going to repeat that again, okay? Hashem's hiddenness, his contraction of himself, in other words, seemingly removing himself from the narrative of our lives, is what allows us to recognize our role as his partner in bringing him into the world. And we are confronted with choices, big and small, as each one of us goes through the narrative of our lives. Now, we don't know how these stories are going to end. We never know, right? We never know how the story is going to end. But what we do know is that the narrative of Esther came about at a time when we were moving, as we said before, as Elizabeth brought up, from a time of Hashem's revealed presence in the world to Hashem pulling himself back and making us his partners in the revelation. What Esther does after she sees that her efforts have been successful She asks that the Megillah be written down. She is, she, we say in Hebrew the expression to be Roes Hanolad. She understands what is going to come next, and she knows that we are going to need an example of being able to live with certainty, with conviction, and with the recognition that we have an important role to play in the narrative of our own lives and in the narrative of our nation, the Jewish nation. And so with that, what I'd like what I personally am going to take away from this is that Esther's transformation, we see this in the narrative of our own lives, right? We are dependent and our voices are sometimes drowned out. And and we work very hard to nurture our own voice and to recognize the points where we have the opportunity to make a difference, to be contributive, and to partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we never know how the story is going to end. We never know how things are going to turn out, but we still put in our effort to be that partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu of bringing light into a dark world. And that is what gets us through these very, very dark times. So from small choices to big choices, our role is to be humble and using the definition of humility that we started with, that is to recognize our place, our ability to keep quiet when we need to keep quiet, and to use our voices loudly when we need to use our voices loudly in order to affect the kind of change in the world that allows HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence to be revealed. And with that, we become his partners in times of joy and in times of challenge and in times of darkness. And we recognize our own self-worth and our own value. And I hope that using this process of knowing who we are and what we have to bring into the world will help take us and carry us forward, hopefully very, very quickly, because it feels like we're almost there, to a time where Hashem's presence will actually be revealed once again with clarity and with presence, and we will see a beautiful world that makes sense, that has made sense, a beautiful narrative that has unfolded in a way that looking back will make a lot more sense to us than it feels like right now.